Hello Smedge, you're all pussy shaped there, with your feet tucked under you, looking slightly grumpy. Too early in the morning for this, Stephen. So, time for some reviews. Now, as you're aware, a certain level of louche decadence is de rigueur on this channel. So I decided to do this review as soon as I got up in the morning. It's my day off. I'm wearing the dressing gown. I guess I should be wearing a sort of sumptuous smoking jacket. But I leave that kind of thing to the very wonderful Michael K. Vaughan. You've watched Michael's channel? Lovely guy, very nice chap. And I see myself more sort of in between him and Steve Donahue, I guess. So, you know, but a well-read guys, really has to be said. So we're going to review some things. First of all, I just want to show you something I got in the mail yesterday, which I haven't read. And this is Interplanetaries by Clark Ashton Smith. There will be something else Smith coming up soon on the channel. It may have already come up by now in a thematic sense. This is basically his SF stories, Hippocampus Press. Trade paperback, very handsome. These I thought were print on demand, but they appear not to be and are going out to print, which is annoying. I think this has gone out to print. A Very On, which is his kind of medieval fantasies, have gone. It's annoying. I wanted to get that because I've only got some of them in dark eidolon. I used to have them all, so there you go. But you can't spend your life selling and rebuying old pulp paperbacks. Well, you can, I guess, but you know, time grows short. So that's that. Very beautiful. I think you'd agree. And the first book we're going to review today is Lamb by Matt Hill, who also known as M.T. Hill. This was published in 2023. I did talk about it briefly in a recent video and I've just finished it. And this is an interesting one because it's marketed and packaged as a mainstream novel by Dead Ink, quite an interesting publisher, and they get what would be the equivalent of Arts Council funding, as they used to call it, something else now, I think. And it's set in the near future in a Britain of urban decay, and things have moved forward. It's probably set 5 to 10 years hence. There's self-driving cars, what have you. And it begins with the brief tale of a lorry driver called Dougie Alport, who fundamentally is going to get moved on from his job due to restructuring, and obviously self-drive is coming in and automatic vehicles. He doesn't tell his wife and son, and he fortifies the cabin of his truck, and he decides to take a terrible revenge with it, in which he's killed. And that's the opening thread, and it's quite an interesting sort of way of opening the story. The narrative then shifts onto Dougie's son Boyd, who we see as a 15-year-old going through the kind of alienation a lot of us went through in school. And in that sense, it reminded me of something that Simon Ings did quite well in Wolves, which is a very spiky novel, and there's certain affinities between this and Wolves. And I reviewed Wolves on the channel some while ago, which again is an SF novel which is really disguising itself as an SF novel. It's more really a mainstream novel disguised as SF. There's nothing wrong with that, because when it comes from a solid genre basis, it works out quite well. And Lamb's kind of in that ballpark as well, but it's more SF now. So we'll go on to that. And Boyd lives at home with his mother Maureen. They live in Watford, and they're near the sort of Ring Road M25 corridor, so that his dad can sort of easily get on the motorway and do the haulage jogs, except he's passed on now. And they don't have a lot of money, and they have a cat living at home called Red. And I must say, I found Red the cat, even though he's very sketchily drawn, you know, one is drawn to animal characters and human backgrounds, because so often in novels, lots of people have pets, but they're not mentioned very much. And the cat's mentioned quite a lot, and it's important because one thing that Matt Hill does, he has a thing about foxes, and foxes are mentioned at least probably a dozen times in this book. They're just passing by. And if you read his book Zero Bomb, there's a mechanical robot fox in that, which is described with wonderful prose skill. It really has to be said. That's the thing that really struck me about that book more than anything else, and that was the first thing I read by him. So this is the sort of background. And what starts to happen, there is this obsession which comes up, and this comes up in Martin McInnes as well. This seems to be a really common thing in weird fiction these days, and I guess you could call this weird fiction. And it raises the question of what weird fiction is in the contemporary world. And the more I think about it, the more I think that weird fiction is really science fiction that has the textural feel of horror. And if you go back to Weird Tales, when people like Lovecraft were using the term weird fiction, and you look at the key things in that magazine, Lovecraft, C.L. Moore, Clark Ashton Smith, more often than not they were SF, and they'd have the trappings of fantasy through magic, but it was often misrepresented. So we'll come on to that again in another video, because that's a bigger subject. So the weird fiction thing that comes up in this is that the house starts to get damp, and there's this damp spot on the ceiling of the rooms, the bedrooms in Boyd and Maureen's house. And there's an increasing sort of identification between Boyd and his mother, Maureen, who seems to be gradually losing it. Some very strange things happening with her. And really, the thing about this book is that it doesn't info dump what's really going on until the end. When it does it big time, and it does firmly phrase it as SF, which is good because it kind of clears things up, because it's too easy in lots of ways for a novelist of some skill, and Matt Hill does have some considerable skill, to just come up with strange things and leave them hanging. And I always feel, in a way, that can be really interesting, but it can also be like a get out clause from having to commit to saying anything, and that can be a very sort of annoying thing sometimes. But he does commit towards the end, and he infodumps quite well about what's actually happening. But really, this is a book about feelings and family, and the major theme is reproduction, heredity, generational things, but not in terms of reproduction as sex at all. It doesn't really go into that, and there was a moment where it could very easily have gone into that and gone down a very queasy route, but it would have been an interesting one. And that's the sort of thing that Simon Ings, I mentioned earlier, and maybe Nicholas Royal probably would have gone more into and have been more hard-nosed about. And I think if Matt Hill has a failing, I think sometimes he's too gentle, but that must really, I think I'm talking about my taste. I prefer writers who are a bit sharper and things, really, but somebody has to tread that more middle ground, and he does this really well. And I think that'll make him a lot more accessible to some readers who don't like things to get too pointed and too cutting. They don't want to see the blood pouring out. You know, this guy sort of infers more. And the way he characterises Boyd, who goes on this kind of odyssey, because strange things happen around the house, strange things happen around the cat, and it gets quite sort of body horror and viscous and Cronenbergian, but it's done very, very well. And I really felt for the cat, I have to say, and I worried more about the cat than the human beings, because Boyd, I think there were times when I wish he would shake himself and stand up, but he goes on and he develops another relationship with a young female character who I found really irritating, but in a good way, because in real life you will find some people irritating, and she's really well drawn, and I just wanted to slap Boyd or slap her and say, come on, don't be so unkind to him, and to him, come on, step up, just walk away from this nonsense. And there's a wonderful sort of middle section which describes this sort of urban blighted Britain and what they're doing to survive. It's finely descriptive, but not shatteringly sort of flavoursome. It's subtle rather than sort of slathering it on layer. And that's his merit, but I also feel that for me, that's also the weakness. I prefer somebody who is a little bit more sort of pointed in their prose style, like say M. John Harrison, where the words really sort of grab hold of you. So this is a much easier read, so you can skip through it more. And that, I think, is where its weakness lay for me. It's not a book I could see me reading a second time. So the texture is there. So it's not as rich as M. John Harrison. It's not as rich as Martin McGuinness. And it's not as prickly as Simon Ings. And I keep mentioning these people because these are the people who I think are predominant at the moment in this sort of writing, and who I think are the most interesting out there. And it doesn't really have the pointed pinprick thing that Nicholas Royal does. And of all these writers, I think the best ones are M. John and Nicholas Royal. And it's rather too long, like most books these days, and a bit too diffuse at times, but it is an easy read. The other person it reminded me of, and I got a similar feeling, but not quite. The sentiment was different because he's a male writer. So it's a different sentiment. It was Elia Whiteley's last book. Elia Whiteley's interesting as well, and she did a non-fiction book about fungi, and there is this obsession, I say, at the moment with damp, moss, lichen and plant growth, which seems to be a thing that's going on these days. The work evolves in terms of explaining itself more as it comes towards the end, as I say, but this is really sort of new humanist SF rather than hard SF, so I'm more inclined towards it. But in the end, I didn't really care about it enough. I didn't care enough about the characters. I think I prefer his slightly earlier work. The Breach is probably the best book I've read by him, but that leaves his sort of mysteries unrevealed in lots of ways. But it is tougher, and drier and more rasping. It's rather like sort of grabbing hold and crushing a load of sort of bracken, you know, it's that sort of dryness, but this is more damp, as I say. And I'm not sure if I'll really continue with reading his work. I just see what he does next. And it's interesting that he's rebranded himself as Matt Hill and gone into mainstream packaging as opposed to MT Hill, which is SF, where I don't think he's had a lot of attention really. And to sum up, this was an easy read. It was quite enjoyable. I was quite pleased when it was over, so we'll have to see. So I say, if you're going to read something by him, even though in lots of ways this is probably a better book than The Breach appealed to me more because, as I say, it was more arid and a little bit more like the work of, say, Simon Ings or M. John Harrison. So that's today's review. There'll be more to come soon. So another day, another book review, but before we start, what am I up to? Well, we've got the William Morris mug. We've just had some rather cheap orange juice, which wasn't very nice. But, you know, isn't that lovely? And, of course, Morris wasn't just a great designer, science fiction and fantasy writer as well. And, of course, that's what we're talking about today as ever, or not as ever, but most of the time. And we're here in the hideout again. And as you say, I'm slightly less louche than in the first segment. I bothered to dress, even though I'm wearing some of my oldest clothes. Those of you who've been watching the channel for a while will know this garb of old. And today we're going to talk about The Businessman, A Tale of Terror by Thomas M. Disch, presented to you in the rather gorgeous Cape hardcover First UK from 1984. We're going to have a look at that. And before we begin, what else have I been doing? Well, I've just, I'm about to send off an email to Pan Macmillan. This is Pan Macmillan News, which I get at work, and booksellers only get this, and they're offering me a free copy of Alien Clay, the new Adrian Tchaikovsky, if I send them an email, if I get in before them. There it is, look at that. So we'll have a look at that. So we might get that, because I don't really buy Adrian's books anymore, but that's a singleton, so I'll get fancy that. I do like singletons, as you know. And I've had a rather charming letter and care package in the post from the very wonderful Matt at Bookpilled. Hey Matt, thank you very much. And I've got something to send to him as well. And he sent me this. He did say to me in one of our many communiques that he was watching out for a copy of this. This is, and you will see now, it's Star of the Unborn by Franz Werfel. Look at that. And as you see, it's in a bit of a state, but this is a very, very rare book indeed. Graham, the other grumpy old man, claims to have one, but he can't find it. And of course, Matt reviewed this about a year ago on Bookpilled, and he went sort of quasi-viral and sold loads of copies, but it's very hard to find. And he did say to me, if I ever pick one up in the wild again, it's yours, because I'd love to know what you think. So I'm going to read that sometime this spring and do a review on the channel. But thank you very much indeed, Matt. That's very kind. And, you know, when something is really rare, you've got to buy the first copy you come across. And, of course, in the days of the internet, you can get most things, but that's pretty uncommon books. So thanks a lot, Matt. Really appreciate that. So that was really nice to come home after nipping out this morning and just, you know, come across a lovely little parcel. I didn't know what it was, and super stuff. So thanks again, Matt. Now, Thomas M. Disch, The Businessman, A Tale of Terror. And I think this is an important book for Disch, because this is where we see him moving into a new phase. There's going to be a Thomas M. Disch roundup covering his entire career, probably in early February. I would do it before, because I'm in a very Dischian mood, but I am waiting for some books to come from the States, which they won't arrive for a few weeks. So when they've come, I'll do that. But as you see, it's very beautiful indeed. Why is it important in the Disch canon? Well, Disch really, he was a science fiction writer from his first publications in the early 60s through to the mid 70s. And then he started to pull away a bit. And there's a kind of transitional period in which there's a book called On Wings of Song. And there's a mainstream novel he wrote with his partner, Charles Naylor. And I'll be showing you all these when we do the Disch overview. And then there seemed to be relative silence for a while. And then this book appeared in 1984. And I first bought it as a Paladin paperback in 1986, it would have been, or 87. And I'll flip the cover up on the screen, very beautiful. And I started to read it, and I'd read a lot of Disch at that point. I'd read most of the major sort of SF works. I hadn't read some of the minor ones. And it didn't sort of chime with me. And I think it's more about what I was reading at that point. If I think what I was reading 86, 87, it was a really sort of busy time in genre SF, both in the UK and the States. If you look at my top 10 USA males SF 1980s video, for example, you'll see why. And I found that it didn't grab me. It wasn't grabbing me, which is an unusual experience for me in Disch. So I put it aside and moved it on. And a couple of years ago, I started to reacquire the things which I'd never read, and I'd never read things from this phase. So this was beginning of a new horror phase for him. And he wrote 4 books over about the next 10 years or so, which get referred to as the Minnesota Supernatural Quartet. And they're not a series as such, though they are set in the same parts of the States generally, and they all have supernatural themes. And they were marketed as horror novels, though they're not horror novels in the sense of Stephen King, as I'll describe. So the funny thing about Disch from this period on is that he was less noticeably literary, but actually smoother, more readable, and ultimately more literary than he was in his earlier work due to his greater experience. And, you know, the early SF is very, very well done. And there's wonderful things like Camp Concentration and 334. And really, he was always literary, but in this phase, he'd sort of got past those SF ideas and he'd reached a new level of professionalism in his prose, which wasn't always as memorable and jagged, but is wonderful to read and incredibly smooth. And I think this period for him is a smoother reading experience than his earlier work, as much as I love the early work, and I do love it. And I'm going to have a bit of a Disch year. I'm going to reread more or less everything this year because I think he's neglected, and I'm going to try and review as much as possible that hasn't been covered by other people. If you look on Richard Rempel's channel, Vintage SF, Richard has covered the genocides recently and also Echo Around His Bones. I've mentioned these things in the past. I'll probably cover some other things as well as I read the things I haven't read and reread things too. So what's different? You know, the black comedy is as robust as ever in this book and the books which follow it, and it ensures that all the characters reveal their farcical aspects. And he satirizes in this book the cotton candy sentimentality of the afterlife that's presented in the kind of books by these sort of fake mediums, those sort of people. And well, what can I tell you about it? And it's presented as a horror book, but as I say, it's not really a Stephen King type thing. It's got an ensemble cast of characters, and Disch is fantastic with ensemble casts. And there's about 6 main characters, and it focuses upon a businessman. And strangely enough, he doesn't appear in it as much as some of the other characters, but it's sort of, he's the fulcrum, he's the pivot. And his name is Bob, and Bob is fat, he likes food, he likes sex, he's pretty vile really, and he has this combat at work with one of his neighbours who's more successful, who's a rising star, and he's on the way down. And Bob has murdered his wife, Giselle, and he's a very unpleasant man indeed, very venal. And Giselle is a character, and also her mother, Bob's mother-in-law, Joyanne Ankers, which remind me of Evelyn Ankers, who was in The Mummy back in the 30s, who has cancer, is dying. So we've got a dead wife, a dying mother-in-law, and she also has, the dying mother-in-law also has a gay son called Bing, and for personal reasons the name Bing always makes my hackles rise, and he's very annoying. He's a bingo caller in Vegas, and he's very unctuous and insincere. And you know, these characters all have their unctuous and insincere sides, and there's a really funny part at the beginning where, with Bob's mother-in-law who's dying of cancer, her friend Alice goes around to see her, and she's thinking to herself that Joyanne is being really inconsiderate by dying at home instead of in a hospital. I don't blame her, I'd rather die at home, but you know, it is what it is. So Bob is really unpleasant. He reads science fiction for pleasure, and Disch gets one of his digs in the traditional SF here. And apparently Bob likes to read John Norman, the Gore books, and he's particularly keen on Norman's non-fiction book Unusual Sex, which of course, like the Gore novels, is all about being tied up, bondage, all that sort of stuff. And he has committed this murder. He's murdered his wife and he's got away with it. And the afterlife, though, and the presence of what's happened to the people around him start to catch up with him, because Giselle goes to heaven, but she doesn't. She's sort of like in a kind of purgatory, and that's very interesting. There's all sorts of characters in this book who die or who are already dead, and you see their antics in the afterlife. And of course, Disch really hated the Catholic Church. He was brought up by it and he really hated it. And Scott Bradfield has talked about this. And it becomes more and more apparent as this sequence goes on, because he does talk about this a lot. And one of the people who comes up in this is the ghost of a suicide, a poet called John Berryman. And I thought, is it that John Berryman? And yes, there was a real poet called John Berryman. And of course, Disch had a secondary career as a poet and was quite successful when he wrote a lot of collections, and they wouldn't have kept being published if he wasn't successful. And he did lots of theatre work, drama, criticism, his actual oeuvre. I'm about to complete my Disch fiction sort of collection, but if I wanted to buy everything else, you'd be there the rest of your life. There's a huge amount of stuff. He was very prolific, really, really was, and a very talented man. So you've got this dead poet in there who's very funny, and a lot of the sort of things you see in the afterlife sequences with this anterooms to heaven and this purgatories are, just fantastic. And they do make you think of Dante. I thought of Dante's Inferno and the different circles of hell. And lo and behold, later in the book, because there's a dead poet as a character, albeit a real dead poet, Dante gets mentioned, as you'd expect. The book begins with a quotation, an epigraph from an American president who talks about spirituality being at the bottom of everything. And obviously Disch had issues with this. And in these sequences set in limbo and purgatory, there's a lot about materialism and the facile crudity of consumer culture interfaces with the materialism we see in the afterlife. We see these sort of pleasant setups, which are sort of aimed at people who are keen to do sort of cruel lace embroidery or something. And it is a funny book. It makes mockery of that sort of fake spiritualism. It's not bitter or bitchy, but it's wry and comedic in that Dante-esque sense, as I said. And it's comparable to Dante and, in kind of an irreverent mood. As with The Priest, which I read just under a year ago, it has a very knockabout plot and very, very funny indeed. And it is horror, but it's not that kind of portentous overemphasis on effect that you get in, say, the Stephen King school. That sort of cod gothic shadow doesn't fall over it. This is horror at the service of a more gentle kind of polemic about people's shallowness and their beliefs in religion and spirituality. And I have to say, I laughed. It's a really funny book. There's a moment when a being begins to possess various members of the cast with terrifying and gory sort of circumstances, but at the moment that the first possession takes place, I just laughed. It was just so funny, and I laughed uproariously at the end of the next section with this possessive sort of being, this demon, if you want to call it that, sort of reflecting on how somebody would respond to their presence and what their presence has occupied, and it moves to other sort of characters in the cast. It's very, very funny. So in a way, it works almost as a kind of satire as well on things like The Exorcist, where possession moves from one character to another, and the whole aftermath of the possession thing really made me smile, and I laughed several times. For sheer entertainment value, you cannot beat The Businessman. I laughed again and again and again at the various things in it about reincarnation. It really is sheer genius. Disch was an absolute genius, such a fine writer. The smoothness, the elegance, the vocabulary, not having to try too hard. And he's at that stage by this point, and it just rolls off his tongue onto the page. And in a way, he's rather like Kurt Vonnegut, but he's not as clod-hopping as Vonnegut, and doesn't suffer from that kind of old fartism, which Vonnegut was actually quite proud of. So, you know, if you do like the satirical, Disch is just wonderful. And his influences, I mean, I can see his influence upon Scott Bradfield. I've mentioned already, he was a wonderful writer, very funny guy. And you can get lots of Scott's books on Amazon. I would recommend them. And he's a great guy. And if you don't watch Scott's channel, do, because it's hilarious, it's brilliant. And he's a big inspiration to me and a lovely chap. But where Disch towers above a lot of other satirical writers is that he has this rather brisk ability to come up with realistic situations which are contingent, that nonetheless conjure intricate and opaque plots. You always know what's going on. You always know who's who. You know, the construction is absolutely immaculate, but it doesn't stop you feeling as if chaos is about to reign, and sometimes it does. But it's a very beautiful chaos with Tom Disch. And, you know, he must have been a great guy to sort of hang out with. He really must have. The rapier wit. It just must have been hilarious to have known him. So I absolutely loved this, and of all the books I read last year, and I don't do that thing where I count what I read, I probably read between 50 and 60, I imagine. The book which stood out to my mind last year, I read a lot of good things, I read a lot of average things, but the book I think I enjoyed the most last year was actually The Priest. And this is in the same ballpark. I think The Priest is better. It's a few years later on when he's got more into this sequence and things. And when I reread them or read them, I will review the MD and the Sub, which are other parts of the series. And there'll be a lot more Tom Disch on this channel. And absolutely fantastic. And I'd say to anybody who likes horror fiction, give them a try. Anybody who's enjoyed his early work, give it a try. Anybody who just likes really good writing, Thomas M. Disch is super fine. And that's how he ended up in Jonathan Cape, of course. He should have had a much healthier relationship with Cape. And, you know, you just fall in love with what he does and his characters and the way he does things, even when they're dislikable. And you just see our world of crass, shallow materialism reflected and in these sort of spiritual clothes, and he satirizes all of it quite beautifully. Marvelous stuff. So on to the next book. The third and final review for this video, and I'm feeling fairly louche this morning, not as louche as I was feeling when I was in my dressing gown. Shocking really, isn't it? And the thing is, I do like doing reviews here in my lounge, but this sofa is gradually sinking beneath the weight of the book-selling bulk, and it's getting quite old now, but it's served this thing quite well. So I should really stop waffling and go on to the final book. And as you will see behind me, there is a very handsome Gollancz yellow jacket of The Killer Mice by Kit Reed. And that is the book we're talking about today. And this is a paperback copy published by Corgi in the late 70s. That was published, I think, 76. Let's check in the paperback. And let's just see. 1976, and the Corgi 78. And this Corgi is absolutely beautiful. I bought this literally a few weeks after I got the hardcover, and I'd wanted the hardcover for years. And I'd read bits and pieces by Kit Reed before, and I'd wanted to sort of delve into a proper collection at some point. But I bought this because it's in beautiful nick, and this has, somebody's written their name in there. I think it says Hemming. And I've got quite a few books with this name written in them, and I've got them, most of them, from, I think, Morris at Zardoz, and they're all in absolutely beautiful nick, and I assume this person has passed on. And, you know, as Dorset Bob said to Giles Burton and I the other day, we're only just custodians of this stuff, you know, we've got to let it go at some point, and that's something to ponder on, I guess. But yeah, very beautiful, I think you'll agree. So where does my journey with Kit Reed begin? I have read bits and pieces by Kit Reed, and looking inside this copy of The Killer Mice, well, it's not this copy, I'm going to look inside this copy because it's got better sources in it, being a hardcover. Let's just have a look. Certainly one of the things I read by her before would have been In Behalf of the Product, not on behalf of the product, in behalf of the product, which is in an anthology called Bad Moon Rising, which Thomas M. Disch edited, and I've had it for many years. Disch did a few anthologies for Hutchinson, and they're all really good. So that was certainly one of the things I read by her, but I couldn't really remember anything about her. And, you know, she is one of those writers who you look her up and you think, she sounds cool. She has a small but acclaimed sort of reputation. You know, she's some of those people who a lot of writers say, you know, she's actually pretty good, you know. And she gets compared to Shirley Jackson, who I must say, apart from Hill House, I really don't like. I like The Lottery, the odd short story. I find Shirley Jackson very discursive through her characters' voices. The characters all seem completely adolescent and chaotic. A bit like Alan Garner's like that as well, even the adult ones. And when you read Jackson's book, Life Among the Savages, which is about her being a mother, bringing her kids up, and of course she's got a writer career on the side, utter chaos, and she just comes as a chaotic woman. And I really generally don't like her writing. So Kit Reed gets compared to her, but is thought of as not as savage and witty and cutting, but more sort of restrained. So that's an interesting sort of analogue to go with. So I'd read bits and pieces, couldn't remember them. When I was in Paris last September, and you can see the video on the channel, lots you haven't watched it, you should, because I go in a bookshop and there's science fiction content in it, as well as just me wandering around Paris, going to art museums and stuff. The book I took with me to read was this, The Best of Science Fiction 10, edited by Judith Merrill. I bought this in Hay in January last year, and I've been reading bits and pieces of it. I've been doing about an anthology a month the last year, which isn't enough. I'd like to do 2 a month, but it's a good way of trying new things and reacquainting yourselves with writers. And this opens with a fantastic story by Kit Reed called The Automatic Tiger. Is it The Automatic Tiger? Automatic Tiger. And I've just reread it, and it's fantastic. It didn't hit me as much on the second reading as the first. And I'm just going to tell you about it because I think it's a very fine story indeed. And fundamentally, it's the tale of a man who is trying to impress his rich uncle. And his rich uncle has this child or other nephew who's a little boy, and the narrator feels that he can impress his rich uncle by buying a really impressive toy for the little boy for the boy's birthday. And he goes in this toy store and buys a toy tiger. It's a wooden tiger, and it just looks amazing, and you get the impression that it's sort of like about this sort of size, and it gets boxed up and wrapped in brown paper, and he takes it home. And this anthology was published in the mid-60s, and the story's from the early 60s. Reed was active from the 50s right the way up until recently. She died in 2017, wrote mainstream novels as well. And he takes it home, and he says, anybody who buys a toy, especially a man, will want to have a look at it. And he unwraps it, and the tiger is actually much bigger, and it seems to grow imperceptibly, and we're not really told that it gets bigger. We just see it getting bigger, and the story's about 20 pages long. And in the box of the tiger comes a little microphone, and you speak at the microphone, and the tiger does whatever you want. And he forms this relationship with it. He calls it Ben because it's a Bengal tiger. He takes it out for a walk, and he starts sort of committing crimes using the tiger. And his confidence swells enormously, and he sort of gets another job, asks for more money, starts betting and winning, spending lots of cash. And his confidence grows to this tiger, and in the end he decides not to give it to the boy. And I won't tell you any more, so try and pick this up. It's a really great story, and I reread it, and it's all about how this mechanical tiger, which is wonderfully explained and characterized, is a sort of analogue for his confidence or lack of in life, and then his overconfidence. And marvelous stuff. I really enjoyed it, and that made me want to read more Kit Reed. So I got myself into gear, and I picked up a copy of Killer Mice, as you'll have seen, and I went for it. So what did I actually think of this? Well, I have to say I was generally disappointed. I'm going to talk through some of the stories, and the most interesting thing about this book, it's not the most interesting, there are some good things in it, but one thing that I found amusing was the fact it's called The Killer Mice. There are no killer mice in this book. There isn't a story called The Killer Mice, and there are no killer mice in it, unless they pop up in a couple of stories, which I admit I DNF'd. So if you've read it and I missed it, tell me I'm wrong, put the stuff in the detail below. But I thought that was quite quirky and interesting, and that's the impression you get of Kit Reed, that she's quirky and interesting. And that is about the best you could say about her, really. She writes well, the writing is fine. There is a similarity to Jackson. She's very discursive, and she has this bad habit of introducing 4 or 5 characters on the same page, and a lot of the time they're just names. And, there is relationship to the sort of focus characters, the fulcrums, but they're just names, and they don't really round out their personalities unless she writes a longer sort of story. And this picture here, if it illustrates anything, it illustrates the story which it refers to on the back, which is called The Vine, which is the opening story, one of the best ones. And that reminded me of The Genocides by Thomas M. Disch. Everything reminds me of Thomas M. Disch at the moment, as you've noticed. And It's about a family who look after this huge plant, this huge vine that grows grapes, and they look after it for generations and generations. And I'm not going to go any further. And that's one of the most interesting stories. It's very eloquent and well written. There are some stories in here I would say are horror stories, which again are quite well written, but some of them are absolute nothings. I'm going to need this copy because that one doesn't have the pagination. And something that we've noticed recently with Golags, people have said, and I've noticed this myself, is that a lot of the Golden Age masterworks don't have contents pages where there's short stories, so the CR more, things like that. It's really, really annoying. So this is proper contents page. Just have a look through it. And there's a story called On the Orphans Colony, which is a science fiction story. It's quite good, turns into a horror story at the end. The Thing at Wedgeley, which is an absolute nothing of a story. It's well written, but it's nothing to it. There's a great novella in here called Songs of War, which is a feminist novella about people see on the side of the valley they live on the mountain, they see a fire and there's a camp there, and it turns out that it's sort of women are leaving home, leaving their husbands behind. They're going to this camp and they're starting this feminist utopia, and more and more women leave and do it, and it turns into a national thing. And it's quite interesting because it ends up as a sort of criticism of the kind of separatist things that writers like Joanna Russ or Susan McKee-Charnas would write in the Motherlines, where you get these utopian feminist ideas that the only way, to deal with men, and that all sex is rape and things like that, is to have a separatist society. And she clearly sees this as unrealistic. There's a lot in these stories about women. There are also women point of view characters, which is absolutely fine. And some of it goes somewhere. There's a story called Cynosure, which is about a woman desperately trying to fit in with her neighbours by having a house that's pristine and clean and what have you, and how she eventually rebels. There are other things about motherhood, but I have to say very few of these things really struck me. There's a story called The Attack of the Giant Baby, and interestingly enough, there is a book by Kit Reed called The Attack of the Giant Baby, and this is it. Now, The Attack of the Giant Baby, as you see the cover there, you see the giant baby, and he's got a toy rhinoceros, which is purple. Apparently it's made by Steiff, according to the story, and this is basically the US edition of The Killer Mice, but it has 5 extra stories and a couple excised, and this came out in the early 80s. And the actual title of this book is Other Stories and The Attack of the Giant Baby. Now, The Attack of the Giant Baby is a fairly funny story. It follows the old 50s model of, the sort of ray gun insect expands in size, that sort of thing. And the child's father is a scientist, you can almost guess it. And it's quite witty, there's nothing wrong with it. And it's very well written, but it doesn't really, sort of go anywhere. You know what it's going to do. And it's just written for a romp and for a laugh, but it does make for an attractive paperback. So there are 3 more stories in this. There's 5 stories in this which are not in The Killer Mice. I haven't read them because, quite frankly, by the time I got to the end of The Killer Mice, I'd had enough Kit Reed. I do have a novel by her which I haven't read, which I will read, but I'm not really certain about whether I'm going to go much further with her. I'm going to give her one more trial, read the novel and see how I get on. That's a more recent work. And there's very much a feeling that looking at the work, which was late 70s, I was trying to see whether she was sort of keeping up. And the late 70s was a strange time in SF. There was a sort of sense in a way that people didn't know where to go and we were waiting for something new and new generation to come along. That was very much there. And what else can I say about this? Apart from Songs of War, the more I look at this book, the more I feel I didn't enjoy it. The writing's fine. It's notions rather than ideas. It's discursive, as I say, and I'm sort of kind of running out of steam, really. I'm really not sure if I want to say any more about it. So that's Kit Reed. So I think I'll be passing that paperback on, even though it's in really good nick. I'll be keeping this because it's a bit of a novelty, and there's 5 stories I haven't read. And I will keep this because I do like the Golags Yellow Jacket. And at the moment, I'm reading a Philip Jose Farmer. I'm looking at some rereading. This is The Maker of Universes for the First of the World of Tears stories, and I managed to acquire some Fantasia Press editions. And I think that's it for this issue. So we end on a bit of a damp squib. I'm sorry about that, but if something's not grabbing you, it doesn't grab you. And if there are killer mice in this, not in this book, and I missed them, let me know. This is Outlaw Bookseller signing out for now. Thanks a lot. Goodbye.